Thank you all for coming to this special seminar. It's a joint seminar between the Center for Healthcare Policy and Research and the Center for Poverty and Inequality Research. We've had a few events this academic year, and this is sort of our last spring quarter event hosting together to bring in speakers across the applied health research space and many disciplines to sort of talk about both important topics like our featured speaker today, but also the methods and the interdisciplinary collaborations that we can have to sort of advance our science forward. So some people are here from a seminar, some people are here for CME, some people are here from our different centers, but we welcome all of you to this session today. We have an extra long session. We have a 90-minute session today, which will be lovely. So please do get your questions ready and sort of your thoughts, because we asked our speaker, Dr. Hamad, to save a full 30 minutes for some conversation at the end of today's talk, and we'll go until 1:30 today instead of 1. So today, we are really lucky and fortunate to have Dr. Rita Hamad, who's an MD PhD at the Harvard School of Public Health. Also trained at UC and was previously at UCSF. So we're still going to claim her. That's what we were just talking about as one of us in our UC system. But Dr. Hamad is a social epidemiologist, and she directs the Social Polities for Health Equity Research Center at the Harvard School of Public Health. And her research focuses on pathways linking social factors like poverty and education and other large structural and policy programs to overall health and disparities in health outcomes across the life course. She uses interdisciplinary and quasi-experimental methods, and she looks for actionable evidence to inform policy making. So she's an expert across many, many fields, but today she's going to be talking about some food-specific policies. And please do, you can enter your questions in the chat, but then we'll sort of gather them and go through them around the 1 o'clock hour. So thank you so much for joining us, Rita. Take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to see some old friends and talk to you guys about this research. So just to confirm again, you guys can see the slide?
Yeah.
All right, great. So so the title of my talk today is Impacts of Pandemic Era Food Assistance Policies on Health and Health Equity. And let me just, there we go ahead and dive in. So here's an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm first going to briefly highlight the theoretical and practical motivations for studying the impacts of social policies on health and health equity. I'm then going to hone in on one specific set of policies that I'll be discussing today, and that's specifically pandemic era expansions to SNAP. The full name is Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It sounds like you guys had Hillary Seligman last week, so maybe she already talked about all of this, but if not, I'll give some details on this policy. I'm then going to describe the methods and findings for one set of studies examining the health and equity impacts of these pandemic era expansions to SNAP. And then finally, I'll end with some conclusions about the broader implications of this work, some next steps, and also get a little bit of a discussion with you guys. So I'm briefly going to start off by mentioning a couple of public health theories that motivate the studies that I'm going to be describing today and that motivate my research agenda more generally. The first here is social ecological theory. Some of you guys might recognize this figure, and this theory really speaks to the importance of social policies as determinants of health. So here you can see that it envisions the factors that contribute to health as this nested set of determinants. On the very inside, you have individual risk factors as the most proximal, and then increasingly upstream factors representing more structural determinants. And so social policies can act on the more distal of these determinants to have broader impacts at the population level. So for example, policies that promote healthier neighborhoods, healthier schools, healthier workplaces can all impact living conditions. Policies can influence institutions like schools or healthcare settings to promote child development or healthcare access. And then you have policies to reduce poverty and material hardship or to reduce segregation, and this influences social and economic conditions. And so much of my work focuses on policies that operate in this more upstream domain. The second theory that motivates this research on social policies and on health equity in particular is fundamental cause theory. So fundamental cause theory builds on social ecological theory by noting that these disparities in health between the haves and the have-nots have been recognized for centuries. And in some cases, the presumed causes of the disparities were ameliorated. So for example, infectious diseases were reduced disparities in infectious diseases were reduced through vaccination campaigns or introduction of antibiotics, and yet we still see these disparities persist over time. And so this theory proposes an explanation for these disparities, and specifically it hypothesizes the existence of these fundamental causes, exemplified by drivers like income, like educational attainment, and this table sort of shows the qualities of these fundamental causes. And so we see that a fundamental cause can influence multiple disease outcomes. It can affect these outcomes through multiple pathways, and it supports access to health promoting resources. And importantly, its relationship with health persists over time via shifting pathways. So for example, historically, income as a fundamental cause might have guaranteed you a brick house instead of a thatch house. And now it ensures that you have a climate controlled home or workplace during extreme weather. And so social and economic policies are relevant because they have the potential to influence these fundamental causes upstream, creating potentially population level impacts. And then fundamental cause theory provides another important contribution to social policy research in particular, which is illustrated in this figure. And this figure maybe gives away that I was a physics nerd in high school, but it's an illustration of the curvature of space-time. And you can see how these more massive celestial bodies or planets have greater gravitational pulls and really tend to pull matter towards themselves. And I like to use this figure when explaining fundamental cause theory because in the same way, fundamental cause theory speaks to the ways that advantaged groups are best able to take advantage of new resources when these are made available and poured into our system. And so any additional health promoting resources you pour in will flow to these advantaged groups unless there's some intentionality to counter the forces to promote a more equitable distribution. And so well-designed policies can help do this to advance health equity. So I've highlighted some of the theoretical motivations for this research, and I also want to mention the practical motivations for examining the health impacts of social policies. So specifically, there's really a critical need for this kind of research to inform policymaking. So to start with, we know that social policies have the potential to influence population health. And for some policymakers, like those at the CDC or others in Department of Health and Human Services, might be interested in policies for that reason because they influence population health. But at the same time, we know that population health influences, many other things like healthcare spending. We know that a healthy population is more likely to be economically productive, and we know that a healthy population is less likely to experience social discontent. And so this research is informative for policymakers with broader concerns about the economy or social well-being or whatever. And just to note, calls for this kind of research are coming from the government itself. So here's a quote from the Congressional Budget Office, which is the main governmental office that publishes projections about how any given policy is likely to influence the budget or other economic outcomes. And CBO says the literature is lacking on how policies that focus on nutrition, education, housing, and employment would affect the federal budget through their influences on people's health. And an evidence-based body of research would enable CBO to estimate the effects of these policies on the budget. So in other words, CBO recognizes that a lot of the research focusing primarily on the economic outcomes of these policies fails to capture important impacts on health. And this kind of research is needed to make good decisions about what policies are worth pursuing. And then this desire to inform actual policymaking also motivates the methods that I use in my research, which are sort of exemplified by the studies I'm going to be describing today. And specifically, I use quasi-experimental designs to best capture the effects of policies, since these types of studies are prioritized for inclusion in analyses by CBO and other decision-making organizations. So let's move on to talk about the actual social policies of interest. And so here's one way to organize thinking about categories of policies relevant to health. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are sort of, moving from the right to the left, you have more and more upstream policies. And so the first column represents policies that influence upstream or fundamental social determinants of health, like education and income. And then the second column represents policies that affect downstream social drivers like health behaviors, environmental exposures, workplaces, housing, etc. And so for my research agenda in particular, I most often focus on US education policies or US income policies that mostly operate through the tax system. But for the talk today, I'm going to be focusing on another body of work that looks at the effects of US safety net policies that provide food assistance for low-income families. So let's get into the details. So let me start by giving a little bit of background. First of all, about food hardship. And again, some of you guys are probably familiar with these kinds of disparities. And so this slide illustrates trends in food hardship by year, and it splits it out by racial and ethnic subgroups. And we see an increase in food hardship across all groups going from 2019, which is the orange bars, to 2020, which is the light blue bar. And you can see that there's a similar relative increase among the different racial and ethnic subgroups, but also that there is a really much bigger absolute increase among Black and Latino families. And you can also see that these rates were persistently elevated even into 2021, which is the dark blue bar, again, especially among Black and Latino families. And not to belabor the obvious, but of course, we know that there have been racial and ethnic disparities in health and health promoting resources long before the pandemic, as you can see in a small way just by looking at the orange bars from 2019. And this figure shows parallel disparities in financial hardship by race and ethnicity. This one illustrates differences in difficulty paying for household expenses beyond just food. And I mean, it's really staggering that over half of Black and Latino families experienced financial hardship in 2020, which is the light blue bars. And this was still about 40% by 2021. And I just want to briefly acknowledge these figures are missing Native American and additional racial and ethnic groups just because this particular Center on Budget and Policy Priorities didn't report those in this figure. But we know that financial hardship was also strikingly high among Indigenous people during this period and more generally. So to buffer families from this material hardship, state and federal governments really engaged in unprecedented spending on social safety net policies during the pandemic. So for example, here you can see funding amounts for the largest of the US safety net policies in a typical year before the pandemic. So this includes UI, which is unemployment insurance, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is the largest US poverty alleviation policy, the Child Tax Credit, or CTC, SNAP, again, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, et cetera, et cetera. And then during 2020, Congress passed the CARES Act, which increased unemployment benefits and provided stimulus checks that dwarfed this prior spending. And then I've also added to this figure spending on the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, of 2021. And this again dwarfed spending in a typical year. And ARPA included another round of stimulus checks, as well as expansions to the Child Tax Credit and SNAP. And so let's talk a little bit more about SNAP. For those unfamiliar with it, this policy is formerly known as food stamps, and it's the largest food assistance program in the US. Even prior to the pandemic, SNAP supported about 20 million households, or 40 million people per year. SNAP benefits are dispersed monthly in the form of an electronic benefit card, and the benefit can be spent on food and drinks, but not alcohol or prepared foods. And as you can see from this figure, there was an increase in SNAP enrollment during the pandemic, and it's largely due to more people qualifying because of new economic hardship. At the same time, there were also expansions that increased the generosity of SNAP benefits. So the average baseline benefit size in 2021 was $127 per person per month, but temporary pandemic era emergency allotments, as they were known, added another $92 per person per month on top of that 127. So again, nearly doubling the size of the benefits during this period. So there was actually a bunch of changes to SNAP during this window, and we've mapped them out in this timeline of just 2020 to 2021. This included things like allowing online purchases, increases to benefits of various sizes for different types of families. And I've highlighted in red one of the largest expansions, which involved a 15% across the board increase in the monthly SNAP allotments for all SNAP enrollees, this happened in January of 2021. This is the one that we're going to focus on in this first analysis that I'm going to be discussing today to understand how it affected food insufficiency and other related outcomes. Another thing to note is that the emergency allotments were implemented nationally, but they were temporary, and different states began to phase them out at different points in the ensuing 2 years, and states were allowed to start terminating the benefits in March of 2021. So we're going to fast forward a couple of years, and again, here's this timeline where you can see changes to SNAP occurring during 2022 to 2023. And what you can see is that as of March of 2023, there were about 35 states that still had the expanded SNAP emergency allotments in place. And in March of 2023, the federal government announced the end of the COVID-19 public health emergency, and the SNAP emergency allotments, or EAs, were discontinued in all the remaining 35 states. And then this expiration of benefits is the one that we're going to examine in the second study that I'm going to be describing today, again, estimating the impacts on food insufficiency and other related outcomes. So one benefit of examining both the expansion and the expiration of the program is that this strengthens our confidence that the findings are due to the policy change itself, rather than other policies happening around the same time. And in particular, if we see an inverse effect between the expansion and the expiration, that sort of strengthens our confidence in the findings. So getting a bit into the methods. Sorry, I'm just going to take a sip of water. The data set that we used was the U.S. Census Household Pulse Survey, or HPS. And HPS was set up in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it involved serial cross-sectional internet surveys that were administered from April 2020 until October 2024 on a bi-weekly to monthly basis. And I was very excited when I got invited to participate. I don't remember what month it was, but one month I got the text message that said, "You're invited to be in HPS." And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be in one of the data sets that I analyzed. So maybe some of you guys got these messages too, because it went out to, like, as you'll see, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people really over the course of the pandemic. So anyway, to study the January 2021 expansion, we used data from August of 2020 to March of 2021. And then to study the March 2023 expiration, we used data from November of 2022 to July of 2023. So for each of these, this gives us about 4 to 5 waves before and after each of the policy changes. And the idea is that we're capturing the policy change, but avoiding other major changes to SNAP and other policies during the period. So we used individual demographic factors to identify individuals who would be eligible for SNAP based on the federal and state income criteria. And for these pair of studies, our outcomes included food insufficiency, food pantry use, difficulty paying household and housing expenses, and mental health. And in HPS, mental health included 2 different sets of variables. One was the Patient Health Questionnaire, or PHQ, which is a screening tool for depression and captures depressive symptoms. And then the GAD, the Generalized Anxiety Disorder Questionnaire, which is a screening tool for anxiety. And each of these were included in HPS as like a 2-item score. And then we restricted the sample generally to those who were eligible for SNAP based on their self-reported demographics. And then for the expiration analysis, we also restricted the sample to those states that still had the emergency allotments in place as of March of 2023. And so this left us with a sample size of about 51,000 for the expansion study and about 41,000 for the expiration study. For both analyses, we use difference in differences analysis. And I think more and more people are aware of this method these days, and some of you guys already might use this method, and so apologize if this is too simplistic, especially for trainees in the audience or those unfamiliar with diff and diff. I want to get the basics set up here. So diff and diff is an econometric technique, and this is like a stylized description to illustrate what our study was doing. On the x-axis, we have time. And you have the vertical dotted line, which represents when the intervention happened. In this case, the SNAP policy change, either expansion or expiration, depending on which study. And then on the y-axis, you have an outcome of interest, which in this case, I have food insufficiency here. And then the 2 sort of diagonal lines represent the treatment and control groups during the pre-intervention period. So in the primary analysis for both of these papers, we defined the treatment group as individuals who were eligible for SNAP and who self-reported receiving SNAP benefits. And then the control group was individuals who were eligible for SNAP but did not report receiving benefits. So about a fifth of people who are eligible for SNAP don't get the benefits that they qualify for. So this is like a decent sized control group. And then in the post-intervention period, we have the observed change over time in the treatment and control groups. Again, this is stylized, not based on our actual data, but this is just giving you a sense of what the method is doing. So essentially what diff and diff does is it extrapolates that the trend in the treatment group would have remained the same as the trend in the control group had the intervention not occurred. And then any deviation we see between observed and expected is the treatment effect of the intervention. So this is analogous to a randomized controlled trial, except that the treatment assignment is, of course, not truly random, which was what makes it quasi-experimental instead of experimental. So diff and diff relies on a few assumptions, and one is that the two groups would be similar in the absence of the intervention. Of course, a lot of people might be thinking it doesn't make sense to compare recipients with non-recipients, even if they were all technically eligible for SNAP, because of course there's important differences between the two groups that might lead to differences in SNAP take-up. But diff and diff assumptions don't require that the groups be identical on all observed characteristics. Rather, the assumptions are requiring that the slopes would have remained parallel in the absence of the intervention, and that's known as the parallel trends assumption. So of course, you can't actually test that because it's a counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened in the absence of the policy, but what people do typically do is they check that the trends were parallel during the pre-period. And so if they're not parallel, then you would be concerned that your comparison group is not an appropriate control group for the treated group. And we can check that, and I'll show you the results in a few slides. And then we can also check whether there were differential compositional changes in the two groups over time to make sure that differences in the composition of each group aren't driving the results that we see. And I'll, again, also share the results of those in a few slides. And then we also did some other sensitivity analyses, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So for those who like to see equations, this is the equation for the empirical model to show what the analysis is actually doing. So diff and diff essentially involves regressing each outcome on an interaction term between whether an individual is a SNAP eligible recipient versus SNAP eligible non-recipient, and whether their observation was recorded after the SNAP policy change, again, either after the expansion or the expiration, depending on what study. And then we also adjusted for other individual level covariates, as well as fixed effects, which are indicator variables for state of residence and for survey week. So the survey week fixed effects are accounting for secular changes like underlying temporal trends that are affecting all people similarly because of other things related to the pandemic or something else going on during the period. And then we also have heteroscedasticity robust standard errors. And then in this analysis, beta 1 is the coefficient of interest, and it's basically estimating the effect of the SNAP policy change on these outcomes. And in one of the analyses, we actually took diff and diff one step further to carry out a difference in differences or triple difference model. And here we wanted to examine whether different subgroups, and in particular racial and ethnic subgroups, experience differential impacts of the policy change. So for example, I showed you that there's differences in baseline food hardship and material hardship due to historical and current structural racism. We know that there's differences in take-up of SNAP among eligible individuals based on language and immigration status. HPS doesn't include questions on immigration status. So here, for that analysis, race and ethnicity is sort of serving as a crude proxy. But basically, triple difference analysis involves a triple interaction term. And here again, beta 1 is the coefficient of interest, adjusting for all the double interaction terms, the main terms, covariates, etc., just like the other model. So here are the handful of sensitivity analyses we did to test the robustness of our results. And these ended up being slightly different for the expansion analysis versus the expiration analysis because the reviewers of each paper asked to see slightly different specification checks. So for the expiration analysis, in one sensitivity analysis, we restricted the sample to only those eligible for the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC. Again, I mentioned it's the, a major US poverty alleviation policy. EITC benefits are distributed around the same time of year that the expiration took place in March during tax filing season. And so that was the motivation for that analysis, and that was not as relevant for the expansion analysis, so we didn't do it in the expansion paper. Second, we did an analysis where we used federal SNAP eligibility criteria to calculate SNAP eligibility instead of state criteria. Federal criteria are more restrictive, so the result ended up with a much smaller sample size. But the idea here was to reduce measurement error because states often use other criteria to develop SNAP eligibility, to determine SNAP eligibility, and those variables aren't available in HPS. And this was done for both the expansion and expiration analyses. Third, we used a different identification strategy, in other words, a different treatment and control group. And so here the treated group was anyone who was SNAP eligible, regardless of whether they self-reported receipt of the benefit. And these people were compared to a control group, which in this case was near eligible people who are almost eligible for SNAP, but they're just above the income cutoff. And the idea here is that this is sort of like an intent to treat estimate. It avoids problems with people misreporting SNAP benefits or sort of the selection bias of who actually ends up taking up SNAP among eligible people. And this one was done just in the expansion paper in response to a reviewer comment. And then finally, we did a placebo test. Here we were comparing people who were SNAP eligible, but who reported not receiving benefits. And we compared them with higher income individuals who were ineligible. And here we would expect these results to be null. That's why it's called a placebo test. And here neither group should have been affected by the SNAP policy change. And so we would not expect to see an effect here. And this one was done only in the expiration paper, again, in response to a reviewer suggestion. So you don't have to remember all of these. I'll walk us through them again later when we get to the results, but just to give you like the big picture of what kinds of sensitivity analyses we thought about. Okay, so let's start looking at results. So this is, of course, table starting off with the sample characteristics, and here we tabulated them based on whether the individual was observed before or after the SNAP policy change, and whether they were a SNAP participant or non-participant. And here, these are the descriptive characteristics for the expiration study, and the sample characteristics were pretty similar for both papers. And of course, you can see that several key characteristics do differ between participants and non-participants. For example, and they're all eligible for SNAP, remember, but some of them just actually report participating versus not. And so SNAP participants are more likely to be younger, to be female, to be Black, or another racial or ethnic background compared to SNAP eligible non-participants. So one key assumption to check for diff and diff again is that these differences in demographic factors between the treated and control groups were similar during the pre and post period, so that differential compositional changes over time aren't what's driving our results. And so to evaluate that, we conducted standardized differences tests to assess covariate balance. And this involves comparing pre-post differences in the treated group to pre-post differences in the control group for each of those covariates. And so all of the values of those standardized differences tests were below 0.25, except for one covariate in each analysis. Nevertheless, we do include all the covariates in the models to increase precision, if nothing else. Here's a different way that we assessed whether there were differential compositional changes in the treatment versus control groups over time that might be explaining the results. And what we did here was we plotted out the proportion of SNAP eligible individuals who self-reported SNAP receipt by survey wave. And here there's two main takeaways from this figure. First, it shows that there were no dramatic changes in self-reported SNAP receipt with the expiration of the emergency allotments. And this was similar for the period right around the expansion, but we didn't make a pretty picture for that one, so it's not shown here, but the results were pretty similar. And second, this figure confirms the measurement error in our treatment group. So remember I said that SNAP take-up among eligible people is actually around 80%, and here this is saying about 50%, 45–50% of people are reporting SNAP take-up. And so this suggests that our control group is probably contaminated people who actually did receive SNAP. meaning that our results are probably biased towards the null and that the true effect size might be larger than what I'm about to show you. And this is sort of a documented thing. We know that people often misreport their safety net benefits in surveys. And so we're sort of also just documenting that. Okay, so then meanwhile, here are the average values of the outcomes across the treated versus control groups in the pre versus the post period. And so you can see again, the values are different for some outcomes between the treatment and control groups during the pre-period, indicating worse health among participants relative to non-participants. Again, diff and diff relies on the trends rather than levels being similar during the pre-period. And I'll show you that parallel trends assumption testing in a few minutes. And for those who are not familiar with this outcome, food insufficiency, it's a standard measure. It was developed by the USDA, and it's a little bit different from food insecurity. The differences are that number one, it captures food hardship in the past week, while food insecurity is typically measured for the past month. And in this case, we created a binary variable for food insufficiency using an established cutoff. And the cutoff captures both marginal and severe food insufficiency, which is why the prevalence is like just astoundingly high in both groups, actually. It's like about 70%. So our next analysis, again, was assessing the validity of the parallel trends assumption. So we did this in a couple of ways. First of all, we restricted the data to the pre-period, and we examined the coefficient on the interaction term between time and SNAP receipt. And here we saw that the trends were parallel. So you see pretty much null results for all the outcomes, except for a statistically significant but very small coefficient on food insufficiency in the expansion analysis, which is shown here. And then the next thing we did was conduct an event study analysis, and that's where you examine time more granularly and have coefficients for every survey wave. And those were also reassuring for all outcomes in both the expansion and exploration studies, and I'll show you an example of those in a few slides. Okay, so the results of the first diff and diff analysis, and this is again for the SNAP expansion. And here we saw that the SNAP expansion was associated with a reduction in food insufficiency of 2 percentage points, which is about a 3% decrease from baseline. And we saw a reduction in difficulty paying expenses of about 3 percentage points, which is about a 4% decrease from baseline. And there were no changes in children's eating, in use of free groceries at food pantries, or in difficulty with mortgage payments. There was also a decrease of 0.09 points in the anxiety score, which is again about a 3% reduction from baseline, and no change in depressive symptom scores. So the next thing we did was conduct subgroup analyses by race and ethnicity for the expansion analysis, and we actually found, for the most part, no differences for most of the outcomes. The one exception was people's use of free groceries or food pantries, and here we saw decreased use among white families, so people weren't relying on food pantries as much with the SNAP expansion among white families, but we actually saw a slight increase among Hispanic and Asian families. In terms of what might be driving that increase, what we hypothesize is that this might be due to the fact that these groups, Hispanic and Asian families, maybe have a higher likelihood of being immigrants who are either ineligible for SNAP benefits, or who may have more confusion about the application process because of language or other barriers. And of course, it might also be just due to type 1 error, that is multiple hypothesis testing. And then here we have the results of the SNAP emergency allotment expiration. And here we see a 7 percentage point increase in food insufficiency, which is about a 10% change from baseline. And we also see 2 percentage point increases in food pantry use and in difficulty paying expenses. We didn't see a change in mental health in the sample overall, and I don't have those null results here. And then for this study, I promised I'd show at least a couple of the event study figures. And so here are the results of the event study. This in part evaluates the validity of the parallel trends assumption. And you can start seeing the policy impacts here. And so here, if you look at the sort of the negative coefficients, those are the pre-expiration period. And you can see that all those confidence intervals include the null. And so that suggests that the trends for recipients and non-recipients that were parallel during the pre-period. And this was similar for the other outcomes. I just don't have those figures here. And then this figure also, again, if you look at the post-period, reinforces the main findings, because you could see food insufficiency and use of food pantries rose in the post-expiration period. And so here again, in subgroup analyses by race and ethnicity for the expiration study, for most outcomes, there were no differences across groups in the impacts of the expiration. In other words, most groups had similar worsening in the outcomes of interest. And the one exception was for anxiety symptoms, which is the figure on the right, where we saw an increase among in anxiety symptoms among Black SNAP participants in particular, relative to white participants after the SNAP expiration. And again, this might be a real finding, for example, because of decreased financial resources to buffer Black families in the face of this loss of benefits, which might have resulted in worse mental health. Or again, this might be due to multiple hypothesis testing, because we didn't see this consistently across all the outcomes. So as I mentioned, we conducted a few different sensitivity analyses. So first, we restricted the sample to those eligible for the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC. Again, largest U.S. poverty alleviation policy. And for those who aren't familiar with it, EITC eligible families typically receive an average of about $2,500 each year in the spring as a tax refund. And here we were concerned that the EITC is distributed about the same time that the SNAP emergency allotments expired in March. And maybe the treatment and control group have differential take-up of the EITC. And this also, in a way, lets us see how the benefits from these two policies might be interacting. And so here, when we restricted the sample to just those eligible for the EITC based on their self-reported demographics, we still see this large increase in food insufficiency. But the impacts on food pantries and expenses were no longer significant. And it might be that getting this large EITC refund at about the same time the SNAP emergency allotments expired might have buffered individuals in both the treatment and control groups from more serious impacts of the expiration. The next secondary analysis that we did in both papers was comparing the results when we used federal SNAP eligibility criteria instead of state criteria. Again, this reduces measurement error due to unobserved state eligibility criteria, things like wealth, which HPS just doesn't measure. But it also is a little bit problematic because we have a smaller sample size. So here actually the sample size that we had to work with when we were using the federal criteria was less than 1/3 of the sample size for the state analysis. And so here you can see the results were similar for both analyses, but the confidence intervals were much wider. And then several of the observed associations were no longer statistically significant. And again, we're sort of chalking this mostly up to the huge loss of sample size when using the federal criteria. And then again, for the expansion analysis, reviewers asked us to also compare SNAP eligible individuals to SNAP near eligible individuals. Again, people whose incomes were just above the SNAP cutoff. And again, this is sort of like an intent to treat analysis. And it's actually a common analytic technique when evaluating the impacts of safety net policies is comparing eligible to near eligible people. And unfortunately, in this case, the parallel trends assumption was violated for a lot of the outcomes. And so we weren't able to proceed with this as a secondary analysis. And then finally, for the expiration analysis, we did that placebo or falsification test where we compared SNAP eligible non-participants to higher income people. And of course, we wouldn't expect to see an effect of the expiration in either group. And indeed, the results were reassuringly null. So, sorry, another sip of water. To summarize the findings from these two studies, we see that the pandemic era SNAP expansion in the form of these emergency allotments, these changes were associated with not just reduced food insufficiency, but also improved mental health. And we see inverse impacts on food insufficiency when these emergency allotments expired. In terms of policy implications, one important piece of context is that Congress did in fact pass a permanent expansion. Well, I shouldn't say permanent because things might be changing now. They passed a more permanent increase relative to the EAs in October 2021 as part of the Thrifty Food Plan, and that resulted in a 21% increase in benefits. But despite that increase in benefits for everybody, we still see this dramatic increase in food insufficiency and material hardship when the emergency allotments expired in March of 2023. And so this suggests that the Thrifty Food Plan expansion was not enough, and that many families still have unmet needs, especially because there continue to be inflation, et cetera. More generally, in terms of policy implications, SNAP benefits are often proposed for the chopping block. And in fact, if anyone's been paying attention, there is a proposal being considered by Congress right this very minute to limit benefits for different populations, for example, by imposing work requirements or by reducing benefits. And while, my team's research isn't looking at the effects of work requirements, but others have shown that work requirements most often result in eligible people losing access to benefits they still qualify for, just because it's really hard to complete the paperwork to prove eligibility and deal with those administrative burdens. But our study does contribute to this broader literature on how more generous and less restrictive SNAP policies can improve health and well-being for economically disadvantaged individuals. And finally, while both of the studies suggest that the SNAP expansions reduce socioeconomic inequities in health by directly targeting low-income people, we didn't see consistent differences in health impacts among different racial and ethnic groups. So in prior work, we did see differences in the impacts of other pandemic-era safety net policies, like the child tax credit, which was providing income benefits. So it might be that this study was a little bit smaller than that other study, and it maybe was underpowered to detect small differences, or maybe there's less dramatic differences in take-up of SNAP compared to the CTC across different subgroups. And at the same time, there's still a lot of work to be done to look at subgroup effects based on other equity relevant dimensions like immigration status and language, which again, unfortunately, aren't present in HPS data. So just in terms of next steps for my team, as I mentioned, there was a staggered expiration of the SNAP emergency allotments in about 15 states prior to the March 2023 final termination that we looked at in this study. And so we're currently doing analyses using newer heterogeneity robust diff and diff methods to examine the impact of those expirations. And the thinking there is if we see results that are similar to these findings, again, this sort of strengthens the case that the changes we're observing, strengthen the chance that the changes we're observing are in fact due to the policy and not some other concurrent policy. And then other things we're doing, we're looking at the impacts of this expansion on other kinds of outcomes among children to get a more holistic understanding of the impacts of the policy. And we're also looking at, again, broader pandemic era safety net changes like the child tax credit and others. And so this is like a sort of a shift in direction. Before I end my presentation, I wanted to zoom out a little bit because the organizers of this seminar wanted me to address like some bigger picture research topics. So in particular, I know that the audience today is very interdisciplinary, which is great. I consider myself an interdisciplinary researcher. And I hear a decent number of trainees who might feel that they are also interested in topics that span disciplines. And I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience as a researcher who's trying to bring together theories and methods from different fields. You'll notice I talked a lot about social epi theories, but then using econometric methods. And so I sort of see the work that I do as inspired by like this little Venn diagram of 3 different fields. So first, as Courtney mentioned, I'm trained as an epidemiologist and specifically as a social epidemiologist. So this means that I draw on social epi-theoretical frameworks that sort of speak to multi-level social structural determinants of health. And then as an epidemiologist and trained as a family physician, trying to get at a more nuanced understanding of biological mechanisms that link social exposures to health outcomes. Second discipline, as I mentioned, that I draw from is economics, and in particular using econometric methods for policy evaluation to strengthen causal inference. One example is the difference in differences methods that I described today, and other kinds of methods are things like instrumental variables or regression discontinuity. And part of my motivation when I use these methods is that they are widely considered to be, rigorous and accepted by policymakers and think tanks who are compiling evidence on policy impacts. And then finally, I also draw on insights from the field of public policy, and particularly in the way that I try to focus on social policies, current social policies, thinking about interactions between various levels of government, federal, state, local, etc., and how people interact with government programs. And here, again, the goal is to better inform policymaking. So in the best scenario, I feel like interdisciplinary research is like this interspecies friendship, and everybody gets along, and the research that we do is stronger and more impactful and more credible and more convincing to different audiences. But I don't want to gloss over the fact that this research does have its challenges, interdisciplinary research. So for example, each of these three disciplines that I talked about have very different standards and very different opinions regarding a lot of topics. And I've listed a few of them here that I just want to go through. So one is, what are accepted and credible causal inference methods? So among some people in epidemiology, for example, the types of econometric methods that I talked about are either unfamiliar or maybe don't address the right kinds of methodological concerns that epidemiologists spend time thinking about. Another sort of difference is how people account for confounding, and in particular time varying versus time invariant confounding. The methods can sometimes be very different. And again, people sort of like think differently about how big of a problem each of these issues is, and might discount research that doesn't address confounding in the way that they're used to thinking about it. Standard errors is another way. And so, I mentioned heteroscedasticity, robust standard errors is sort of like how I dealt with issues in this study. And then, but, often when I present to epidemiologists, they want to know, like, why didn't you use multi-level modeling and all kinds of things that are sometimes just incompatible with the sorts of econometric methods that I'm relying on. Missingness. I don't want to feel like this is a laundry list, but so epidemiologists spend a lot of time thinking about missing values and why are they missing and how can we impute them. And it is rare that I see an economics paper where that's even like missingness is even reported or acknowledged. Not to say that there aren't any, but it just seems like much less common. Qualities of health outcome measurement. Obviously, in epidemiology and trained as a clinician, we have a lot more experience and maybe want to see a lot more nuance there. Whereas, I sometimes read the, economics papers where it's like, like some policy resulted in more health. I'm just like, what does that mean? Like these composite measures are generated. So, but they're doing a great job on many other aspects of the methods. And so this is, a little bit about sort of like compromise and where are you going to spend your effort when you're doing a study. And then just these last couple of points are just like practically speaking, when you're getting ready to publish, I've published in some public health journals where they, like, even before the editors send the paper out for review, they'll say your supplement is too long, you have too many sensitivity analyses, cut some. Whereas the expectation in economics is that I probably only didn't even scratch the surface in terms of what I could have done. And then, number, like how many times is the journal going to send out your paper for rounds of revision before it's published? And is it okay to post your results as a working paper online, even before you send it out for review? This is like super standard in economics. And in public health, it's just like there's a lot of journals that won't even consider your paper if it's been posted as a working paper ahead of time. And then finally, just the focus on whether your results have any practical application. So obviously, I think in public policy is maybe like the most practical in terms in that sense, in terms of like what kinds of questions are focused on. Whereas in epidemiology, historically, there's been like a long history of controversy about like, should you even include a section on policy implications in your paper? And some journals don't even allow it. So just differences in terms of reporting in that way. And then the other big picture thing, again, sort of shifting gears again, that I was asked to touch on by the organizers is how to enhance the policy impact of policy evaluations like the ones I presented today. And the motivation, of course, is that many of us who do this research are doing the research because we're trying to do translational and informative work, and we don't want it to just sit in the pages of an academic journal to get dusty. So one aspect of enhancing policy impact is outreach. So sort of like on the, you've done your study, now what do you do? So at a couple of the universities that I've been at, the university communications team, and it's called different things at different universities, but the communications team can often be helpful in terms of contacts with the press or doing press releases. Often, if you haven't worked with them before, just so you know, you often have to reach out to them a few weeks in advance of your paper being published. You can't do it after the fact. And so that they can get sort of something put together in a timely way to coincide with the release of the paper. Again, depending on what university you're at, there's also government relations teams. And this is less true here at Harvard, but when I was at UCSF, the government relations team was really interested in helping connect me with especially local, like California policymakers in Sacramento, where many of you guys are, who might be interested in the results of the research, and had some really successful connections in that way with policymakers. And then another thing to do, this is maybe actually these are all equally important. I was going to say this one's more important, but these are all equally important. So this third one is to really develop and then leverage your professional networks. So, for people who are more junior or students, oftentimes more senior faculty have more established relationships. Or like if you came from, as in before you trained, as if you came from government or public health or some other sphere, to really sort of rely on that and to try to develop those networks at conferences and meetings. Don't sit shyly in your hotel room, which is what I feel like I did back in the day. But because a lot of times, like when you're later trying to share your work, it's helpful to have those connections as opposed to just like cold calling somebody with the results of a study. And I think social media is also potentially a good way to do this, depending on how you use it. And then at the same time, I do want to say that a single study often does not and probably should not have policy impact, because it is one study with all of the potential limitations of that one study and whatever data set you used and whatever method you used and whatever political context the policy happened during. And so that is really the value of like after you've accumulated some research, either that you've done or that like a team or a field has done. That's really the value of creating policy briefs or other reports to summarize multiple studies to sort of see, like, are we seeing a consistent story here? What are the nuances in terms of heterogeneous impacts or timing of effects or whatever? And academics aren't always, or I feel like they're not usually the ones to do these kinds of reports. Sometimes they are, but more often I see these coming out of think tanks, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, or other kinds of intermediaries. And, sometimes in terms of increasing your outreach, you might want to think about reaching out to those people ahead of time, or when you're ready to share your work. And they can then, like down the road when they're doing a policy brief or something, make sure to include your work. And then I think this is my last slide here, is again, another aspect of enhancing policy impact is developing skills in messaging. And so there are organizations out there who have entire seminars or even like short courses dedicated to this topic. So I'm just going to scratch the surface, like really a high level summary. But basically, we know that we in academia are known for being jargony and technical and very focused on details. And of course, this is all super important when you're actually doing your research and making sure that it's rigorous and getting that all in the journal. But when it comes to then communicating those findings to the press or the public or policymakers or other stakeholders, it's good to learn to try to balance all that nuance with the need for presenting clear and succinct findings that real people can actually understand. And so, when you do quantify your study findings in this messaging, it's good to do so using accessible metrics. So for example, odds ratios I feel like are like notoriously hard to interpret and explain. So maybe instead explaining like the number of people affected or the number of conditions averted or a percent change or something is more helpful. Another thing that's good to include is visual aids. And I think this is actually an aspect of academic manuscripts that doesn't get enough attention. And by that, I mean, you know, a lot of times we include our results as like this very complicated table that even academic readers might have a hard time interpreting. And sometimes I feel like there's no reason you can't convey the same information in a figure with like a very detailed footnote if you want. And then once you have that clear figure, you can also share it more easily to those outside of academia. And I feel like I got better at doing that just because a lot of times I like to publish in clinical or public health journals, which often like the readership maybe is also even more inclined to see things in figure format rather than table format. And then I actually think that being on social media is good practice for this style of communication. And I'm not saying that I'm the best person at social media, but I can tell you that my own skills, I think, have improved from trying to communicate to a diverse audience on social media. And for those who can't imagine themselves getting onto Twitter, for example, I do encourage you to check out Blue Sky, which in the last few months has really developed a very robust academic community. Yeah, so I think that that sort of helps a little bit on all of these skills. It helps you try to figure out how to clearly explain something in however many words you're allowed, and to have like a good visual aid, etc. And so, okay, now I'm ready to end. Just to acknowledge the 2 NIH grants that funded this work. I also want to acknowledge the co-authors on the 2 papers that I talked about today. And then just generally to acknowledge the huge, terrific team of staff and trainees and other colleagues at the Sphere Center who make this work possible. And this is just the Sphere Center website if you want to read more about these studies or our other work. And I am happy to take questions. And oh, yes, it's just about 4 p.m. or 1 p.m. So
well timed. Great job. Yeah, this is great. I think you continue to raise your hand. I was going to get us started with one question, and then I'm going to call on folks or answer in the chat. So get ready. Thank you. You added 2 slides of the ones that I was asking you to think about, and I think Dr. Marion Page might also have questions for you as I think about it. I think the only follow-up I have to both the interdisciplinary work and to the communication is, do you think you've learned by trial and error? I mean, it sounds like you've learned a lot by talking to folks on both of those pathways and then just trying different journals and just being persistent. But do you have any other more like concrete example or any other tools there that you would offer to us about how to do that work? Because a lot of that you're learning the interdisciplinary differences in publishing just by doing it, I imagine. So just wanted to sort of push you any other, just giving it a try, not being scared to publish in a different
yeah,
stuff, like
yeah.
maybe talk about that.
Yeah, no, I'll be honest. I'm still scared to publish an econ journal. I haven't tried it. I think that just because I'm trained as a social epidemiologist, like at Berkeley School of Public Health, right? That's where I got my start. I think I've always just leaned towards those journals and that style of describing. But in terms of how I talk about my methods, that definitely was a lot of trial and error. Especially like, when I was getting started, there was many fewer papers that had econometric methods. And so I felt like my method section was more like teaching. Like if you're just publishing on a regular regression, I feel like you don't have to explain what is ordinary least squares and what does it mean to adjust for covariates and whatever. But for econometrics, I would often in the supplement have like a mini little tutorial, like actually this stylized figure that I showed you guys, I started just including something like that in like almost all my papers initially, just so that people could learn what it was. And I feel like I need to do that less often now, but definitely learning how to describe the methods to justify them and to explain them for unfamiliar reviewers. And then, yeah, I mean, and then I think it also depends on who you're collaborating with. Some of my collaborators are themselves economists or policy folks who are not used to publishing in our public health journals. And so often they will very kindly, or maybe they're also scared and they're just like, you take the lead. I don't know how public health people are going to want this health stuff explained or whatever. And so again, like I've been nervous to go the other direction, in part just because like I just can't believe how long it takes economics journals to publish papers, and in our profession it's just faster. Like you can't post the working paper ahead of time, but they will review your papers much more quickly. But yeah, I do encourage people to just like give it a go, see what happens, see which discipline, you know, it's kind of like in medicine, like trying to figure out which residency you want to go to, find out who your people are, who you want to spend most of your time with, but you're still going to interact with people in other disciplines.
I love that. And have a team so that one person can lead one and another person can lead.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and don't be afraid. That's the other thing I heard. Don't be afraid to teach a little bit or to explain your rationale, to be really
Mhm.
clear about how you're approaching what it doesn't, just differences. That's
Mhm.
great. Thank you for all that practical advice. I'm going to go to Marianne next, and then I'll take your question in 1 second, Sam. Go for it.
Yeah, this is really interesting and wide ranging in terms of the different ideas that you were presenting. So Mike, I have two questions, but they're almost like one is a more detailed question about your SNAP research, and one is a broader question kind of about the way you set up the the presentation overall, going back to some of the models that you were presenting. So maybe I'll start with the more nitty gritty. It's not really very nitty gritty, but it's very specific about the SNAP project. So my memory is from, I don't know, 20 years ago, there were some questions. So I would just say my background is in economics. And so I always am a little bit afraid in these interdisciplinary formats that I'm going to say something in a way that's very offensive to other folks, because we're not
I don't
trained
get offended by economists anymore. I married one, so we're good.
in a socially appropriate way sometimes, because we have no social training. Anyway, that's why we became economists. So anyway, my question is sort of 20 years ago, I think 30 years ago maybe, seemed like there were questions economists were raising, at least, about the, I don't know if integrity is the right word, but the quality, I guess, of the food insecurity measure and what it was really capturing. And I'm sure that that has evolved over time, but it kind of was sitting there in the back of my head. How I don't know if you ever really identified how this survey was measuring food insecurity, and the question isn't like a question out of concern that it's bad, but more how should we think about what that's really capturing, and then whether we should be thinking about the magnitude of the effects that you are finding given the size of the SNAP expansion. And should we think of these as big effects? I don't know enough about how measures of food insecurity end up linking to poor health outcomes. I mean, I buy that food insecurity is not good and that it does link to poor health outcomes, but these measures, I guess it's all really about magnitudes. I'm trying to sort of make sense of whether these are really big effects, whether they're sort of big effects. You could just shed some light. That's kind of I put that in a bit of a
Yeah.
convoluted,
Yeah.
but trying to give some background about why I'm thinking about this.
Yeah, and that is interesting because I had not heard of that concern about the food insecurity measure from an economic discipline perspective. So that's something I'd love to hear more about. I was just like looking up the food insufficiency measure. So let me just put that in the chat for you guys. But the food insufficiency we measured or that we used The food insufficiency measure that we used comes from USDA, and HPS was just using the USDA measure, which is slightly different from food insecurity. And my sense is that it's supposed to be like a more severe form of food insecurity, so people just did not have enough to eat. And there's different ways of like categorizing it, like severe, marginal, etc. And so we included both marginal and severe. And then in terms of trying to quantify like how big of an effect was it for the, let me get my numbers right, for the expansion paper where we were looking at like the 15% expansion in benefits, there was like it was resulting in a 3% change from baseline. And then for the expiration of the benefits, where it wasn't just the 15% expansion that was expiring, but all of the SNAP extra benefits were expiring, that's where we saw the larger 10% increase in food insufficiency. So that was sort of how we thought about like, why are we seeing a much bigger effect with the expiration, as there was expiration of many more things than just the expansion. And so that's sort of how we got a sense of like how big of a, how big is this magnitude, is like the percent change from baseline. So yeah, and I'll have to like read more about the food insecurity concerns that you're talking about to make sure that I'm appropriately addressing them in the future.
Yeah, I didn't mean that as a criticism, and it wasn't
No,
a
no,
long
no,
time
not
ago.
take
I
it
think
though.
Marianne Bittler has, I think Marianne Bittler's got in here the
Mhm.
National Academy's report that if it's around the time period that I'm thinking of might be where I got that. It was more just thinking about you would know much better than most of us, like how do these magnitudes in terms of, the expansions or the contractions, the magnitude of those corresponding to food insecurity and then linking to health outcomes. Like these seem like really big numbers to me.
Mhm.
But we're
I
sort
mean,
of thinking of it as a 0-1 in a sense, right? As opposed to how many more people became eligible, how much more were they receiving, and how does the changes in food insecurity end up mapping onto things we worry about in terms of health in the long run. So that
Yeah.
was kind of that's where I was kind of coming from.
Yeah. And I see Marion's note, and I have added it to my reading list.
And I have another, but why don't we?
Yeah, I was going to say, let's go to Sam, and just to follow up on that one too. I think that is where our public health background, because the long-term life course effects too, and sort of how we detail it out. I think that is another collaboration area. I'm guessing there's a lot written on that, but that's where we would nerd out, Marianne. I was about to really understand, what does it mean when you say you're food insecure, and what kind of things does it show up, right? And from a health context, how does that relate to other health indicators? I think that's an area in which we could work better together. But Sam, you've been very patient. What is your question?
I have two questions. One is methodological, and then the other is about your findings. So my first question, just because I haven't deeply studied differences in differences, I'm only semi-familiar with regression discontinuity. So if my understanding is correct, the timing of the allotment by states was different, right? So what you did then is normalize all of those to 0, and then basically assign that as the kind of discontinuous point. And then from there, using the added assumption that the control group is the same across that discontinuity, that's where you can draw your analysis from in terms of treatment effect, correct?
Yeah, let me pull up the figure again, because I think that's helpful to explain it. So for this particular analysis, all the states experienced the expiration at the same time. So there was that group of 15 states that decided they were going to terminate the SNAP expansions earlier. But here we were focusing on the remaining states in March of 2023 who still had the SNAP expansions in place, and they all had them terminated at the same time, pretty much, like maybe 1 or 2 weeks difference, but pretty much all at the same time. And so here, again, if you're trying to think of this like analogous to an RCT, here you have the before the expiration. Oh, whoops, let me see. You guys can see this mouse probably here. The before the expiration period, after the expiration period, and then the treated and control group. And for the primary analysis, the treated group was people who were SNAP eligible and reported receipt of SNAP benefits, and the control group was people who were also SNAP eligible but reported that they weren't receiving benefits, and so they wouldn't have been affected by the expiration because they weren't getting the benefits anyway. And so then we see like the observed changes over time and the expected change, which again, diff and diff sort of assumes that it would have remained parallel to the control group. And then the difference between observed and expected basically is the effect of the policy change. And so in regression discontinuity, I think somebody, I don't know if it was you or someone else had that question in the chat. Regression discontinuity doesn't have a control group in this way. Like if you ignore the control group line and pretend that you just had this group of people who experienced some change, it compares sort of like effects, let's see, the outcome just above and below the discontinuity. And that's what regression discontinuity is doing. And regression discontinuity, it's generally frowned upon to look at a discontinuity across time in this way, because there might be all kinds of other things happening at the same time that are affecting your same outcome. And without a control group, you won't be able to tell whether it's your event that's causing that, or something else. But that's sort of like how you can think about discontinuity. And I know Marion Bittler has a great paper that I always use in my classes as the example, where she looks at like WIC, and if kids are like right above or below the age cutoff, and using age cutoff to create the discontinuity. But that's sort of how you can think about RD in comparison to diff and diff.
Okay, thank you. I think that helps quite a bit, actually. And then my second question is much simpler, but more economically grounded, which is if you go back to your slide that had the use of food pantries before and after the, I don't, it kind of went by quickly, so I don't remember if the usage went up or down. But I would kind of I remember them going down when not discontinuity, when the expiration happened.
Mm-hmm.
But intuitively, wouldn't you expect that food pantries? It went up. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, because I was going to say you would expect them to be supplements, not complements. But okay, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Yes. Yeah. I think the thing you might be thinking of, let me see if I can go back, is I think it was the subgroup analysis. Here, yes. This one was where, when we did the differences, this was for the expansion, where you might, exactly like you're saying, when there's more SNAP benefits, we would expect people to use food pantries less. And when we did the subgroup effects by race and ethnicity, that is in fact what we saw for white families, but we saw an increase, like a counterintuitive increase among Hispanic and Asian families relative to white families. And here we were thinking that, again, it might be that these, racial and ethnic subgroups might be not eligible for SNAP, more likely to be ineligible for SNAP, or might have other barriers to SNAP use, which is why the expansion didn't have the effects we expected. So that might be what you're remembering. Yeah.
So a follow-up I might ask to that then, that finding is that because you might think, oh, well, people would use food pantries more when they receive SNAP benefits if the SNAP benefit isn't large enough to cover all of their needs. But you can kind of disagree with that by using the fact that use decreased among white families. Is that kind of correct? Yeah.
And even if it wasn't enough to meet their needs, it was still presumably better than before the expansion, or so especially compared to the control group. So that's why, like, we think that this, wherever it went, this one makes sense, that people use food pantries more because all of a sudden their SNAP benefits expired.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Either in the chat or raise your hand and I will call on you. I know there are more questions, but I have one in the middle. I was wondering the causal modeling part. I was wondering keep going on the methods and to go a little more in the weeds with you. Could you talk more about the social epidemiology and sort of this multi-level and causal modeling differences between fields? Because I think that one comes up for me for your paper a lot, like, are you over-adjusting? I'm always worried about over-adjusting for things like, race, ethnicity, plus all the other things in terms of whether or not they're precision variables. And in epidemiology, we spend a lot of time with directed acyclic graphs and all these other things. But could you talk a little bit more about how you think about that in your work, or how you juggle sort of different methodological worlds.
Yeah, no, I feel like my papers are often like a Frankenstein because I often have the DAGs, the directed acyclic graphs. So I might not call it that. I might call it like a conceptual diagram, which maybe if an epidemiologist reads the paper, they'll be like, oh, that's the DAG when deciding what to adjust for. And so, yeah, so I think like I approach it in that sense, but then the point of the quasi-experimental econometric methods, if you put it in epidemiology terms, is often what we're doing is we're trying to adjust for unobserved confounders through the study design as opposed through like throwing in more covariates. And sometimes in epidemiology, it's like you can never adjust for time or like unobserved confounding. You could never do that. Why are you talking about it that way? But then the whole point of having, like, for example, the control group in these diff and diff models is to adjust for unobserved things that are happening more generally in the political climate and whatever through a control group, again, sort of as you would do for an RCT, but without like as clean of a randomization. But I agree that sometimes, like when I read economics papers and they list like the list of covariates, it often is things that I would be like in my DAG, oh, that's on the mediating pathway. Why are you adjusting for that? Like smoking or BMI or whatever. And I'm, and so there's, I often also find myself in that space of like, I'm trying to stay true to the DAG, but also like there's this other method that does a better job than our traditional epi methods for causal inference in these settings.
Yeah, maybe another area where we can continue to talk across. Yeah, because I think I've come a long way over my 20 years of doing this, of really thinking of being more parsimonious in what we adjust for and really trying to hammer it in. And I think that it almost, for our people interested in social policies or social factors, sometimes we're adjusting away the thing that we're trying to show the impact on. So trying to be balanced in that rather than always trying to almost like break down our models to show that they're robust. But Marianne, what other questions do you have?
I don't want to hoard in on other questions people might have, but I mentioned earlier, I also had this kind of broader question, which is as we're starting to hone in on the end of time, maybe is a good one, which is I noticed, so I saw the different models you had up at the beginning, the socio-ecological model, the fundamental cause theory. But what I didn't see as part of that, and that I was wondering about your perspective on, is this sort of increasing appreciation for how historical policies, such as, I don't know if you want to call slavery a policy, but right, how those can affect biological mechanisms that then transfer across multiple generations. And I guess the broad question is, so even if you were to level the playing field now, these biological differences, or I don't even know if biological is the right, but the transfer of these sort of biological things across generations makes it really hard to close race gaps in particular, but probably other gaps as well. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts are about what is the role of policy in, or what can be the role of policy in making up for past not doing well with words today, the remnants of past, how can, I mean, the obvious thing is, okay, so reparations in some sense, but that seems too simplistic because politically that's very difficult. And I'm thinking more about, so for example, black, white gaps in infant mortality and maternal mortality. What can we, if some of that is because of the transmission of biological mechanisms over multiple generations, what do we do about that now? How can we, again, kind of a broad question where I've got a mix up of a lot of words, but just your thoughts about that in general, or examples of policies that might work that could be supported by voters.
Yeah. So the two theories I presented are like just two, and I think there's actually social theoretical frameworks that do a better job of what you're talking about. And actually, like my office neighbor here, Nancy Krieger, has like eco-social theory, which exactly is very much focused on like historical context and the roots of disparities. and also agency in terms of like who is responsible for the disparities and like where does the power lie to ameliorate or continue the disparities, and where people's like interests. And so I think there's other theoretical frameworks also, like I'm sure from like political science. And so I just was like touching on those two, but totally like I think there's other ones that can address more the structural and historical racism pieces. And then in terms of like practically, what does that mean in terms of what policies that we study or promote? I think that doing the kinds of analyses like the ones I did today, where you're trying to look at heterogeneous effects among different groups who are historically marginalized and currently still marginalized, I think helps in deciding like what policies should we advocate for. And I think this is like, you know, political science lingo in that there are policies that are de facto racist versus de jure racist. De jure means like on paper they say something like, you know, like school segregation, like Black students cannot attend the same schools as white students. That's like de jure racist. But then there's also de facto, which means there's nothing on paper that says it should be racist, but in fact it is implemented in a manner that leads to racial disparities. And so I think that that's a lot of what these policies have the potential to be, is you know, potentially anti-racist. They might narrow gaps, not because they're saying we're going to give more to historically marginalized groups than unmarginalized groups, but because they're implemented in such a way or designed in such a way that they are going to narrow disparities, either through like what income groups they're targeting or geographical regions or whatever. And so I think that when we do research, that's sort of what we should be looking for in order to inform that kind of policymaking. I think I hopefully I answered your question. I think that's what I was planning to say.
Yeah.
Jessica. I think you have a question, but you might be still on mute. As you're thinking or as you're coming off mute, I was going to say, I've seen some really interesting work in the last couple of years. It's not quite all the way historical about racism, but in aging studies like the Health and Retirement Survey, that's mostly of older adults actually finding their birth year and finding the place in which they're born, and then trying to actually look at where they were born in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and then what their health looks like. So trying to look at historical policies in the time periods across their life course, which I think is another methodological advancement in how we've been thinking about life course, is really trying to piece together, which is another area, just to make my like fifth plug as this calls, where other fields might have more expertise in other data sets and other historical data that we don't often use in EPI, but we have some other like causal ways and methodological ways to think about it. So Jessica, I just want to make sure you didn't have a question, but I'm going to go back to Sam for maybe the final question, unless you have one. So go for it, Sam.
Hi. So talking about de facto versus de jure racist policy actually made me think about, again, as you say, anti-racist policy, if you want to close gaps. I'm curious what you have to say is about the theory in kind of epidemiology about if you just make a blanket policy that is meant to close any kind of gap, even if we know that there is a racial or gender or any kind of characteristic component to why that gap might exist in the first place, that again, de facto, that policy would become anti-racist in the same way that certain policies were de facto racist because of how they were implemented. Like if you make some policy that's based on income, and minority populations tend to have lower mean incomes, then in turn you would be targeting those marginalized groups more with that same policy, if that makes sense. And I'm wondering if that's something that's discussed.
That's exactly what I was getting at, is that there's ways to target policies in ways that aren't just based on racial and ethnic identity, that still might lead to shrinking of racial health disparities. Yeah, just like that.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
I'm not sure. I think Jessica, unless you're off mute now. I think there's something going on with your hand raised, which is totally fine. It happens to me all the time. I was just gonna sort of end with any final comments from you, Rita, about sort of the place that we're in, and sort of obviously lots of natural experiments in the policy domain happening in this next few years. So there's a lot of change happening. Is there any sort of, heartening words or anything to leave us with, and as we think about working together and studying things, obviously, to improve health amongst this group?
Yeah, I've been giving my own team this pep talk, which is that like our work is just as important as ever, both in terms of providing evidence on what's happening right now as quickly as we can get it out there, even given lapses in access to data sets and whatever that we're experiencing, and also just sort of like summarizing what we know already from a lot of this research in terms of policies that promote health equity, so that even if like the federal government isn't going to make any changes, like in our country, the state governments have a lot of power and they can do their own, food assistance, income assistance, whatever policies. So yeah, so just to say that like stay the course. I know that what we're doing is important, and that yeah, we're just to have hope and persist.
Thank you so much. Oh, Jessica was able to put her question in the chat if we have one more minute. Do you think that the changes after the discontinuation of the emergency allotments would be less pronounced over time as people got used to the emergency allotments being discontinued? Because maybe the public is not really that aware, it seems like, of all these changes, and are they really immediately changing their behaviors, or is can you speak to that?
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah. I mean, I think that
you.
would be an interesting research question. It depends on what else is going on with like rising inflation and supply chain issues and whatever. It's hard to say, but that would be an important thing to study.
Yeah, making a plug for qualitative methods or other things to
Yes. Yeah.
understand
Sure.
how people think about these kind of things. But I love that.
Yeah.
This has been such a fun session. Thank you for spending a whole 90 minutes
Yeah.
with us, Rita. It's really fun to see you. Thank you for both of our centers sort of coming together and getting a great group of people to listen today. I'm sure people can contact you if they have other specific questions.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. Be in touch.
Yeah, so you can
For
reach out
having me.
directly. But otherwise, thank you everyone for coming, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks,
Thank
Mary.
you.
Thanks all.
Bye.